All right, let's dive into a conflict that you probably didn't hear much about in history class, but one that absolutely shaped America's place in the world, the Philippine-American War. It's a really complex story about revolution, a sense of betrayal, and a bloody, complicated fight for freedom. So, picture this. It's the end of the 19th century. After literally centuries of Spanish rule, Filipino nationalists are right on the edge of winning their independence. But just as one empire is fading out, another one, the United States, is rising. And that created this huge, explosive question. Would the Philippines finally be free, or would they just be trading one colonial ruler for another? So, how did this all kick off? Well, it really starts with what many Filipinos felt was a massive, profound betrayal. Okay, so after winning the Spanish-American War, the U.S. sits down to sign the Treaty of Paris. And in that treaty, Spain agrees to sell the entire Philippines to the United States for $20 million. But here's the thing. This massive deal, made thousands of miles away, completely left out the most important voice in the room, the Filipino people themselves. See, while the diplomats were negotiating, Filipino revolutionaries, led by the incredible Emilio Aguinaldo, weren't just waiting around. They had already taken control of most of the country. They declared the first Philippine Republic, and they had absolutely no intention of just swapping one colonial master for another. They were ready to fight for the real thing, self-rule. The whole situation was a total powder keg, and on February 4th, 1899, it exploded. Fighting broke out between American soldiers and Filipino nationalists right there in Manila. And get this for timing. The war literally started just 2 days before the U.S. Senate even voted to officially annex the Philippines. Talk about a point of no return. Now, back in the States, this whole idea of annexing the Philippines, it was not a done deal. Not by a long shot. It kicked off this huge, soul-searching debate across the entire country about what America's role in the world was even supposed to be. And the arguments on both sides were, well, they were complicated. On the one hand, you had people pushing for annexation because of business opportunities in Asia, or because they were worried that if the U.S. didn't step in, Germany or Japan would. And then there was this paternalistic and, let's be honest, racist idea that Filipinos were incapable of self-rule. But the opposition was just as complex. Sure, some people argued that colonialism was just plain wrong and went against everything America stood for. But others, well, they opposed it for their own racist reasons, fearing what it would mean to bring a non-white population into the American system. It's a really messy mix of motivation. You know, the words we use matter. They reveal so much. The U.S. government officially called the war an insurrection. That word frames it as a rebellion, right? Like putting down an internal uprising against a legitimate government. But from the Filipino perspective, no way. This was a war for national liberation. They were fighting to kick out a foreign invader. That one word choice tells you everything you need to know about the two different worldviews. Okay, so let's talk about the war itself, because it wasn't just one long slog. It actually changed a lot. It really had two very different phases. In the beginning, Aguinaldo's army tried to go toe-to-toe with the Americans, fighting conventional set-piece battles. But between February and November of 1899, they just took devastating losses. They were outgunned and outmatched, so they had to make a huge pivot. They melted into the jungles and mountains and started a guerrilla war. And that decision would change everything about the conflict. And when you look at the resources on both sides, it's pretty clear why they had to make that change. The U.S. had a professional army, a constant flow of new equipment, and they controlled the seas. The Filipinos, on the other hand, had almost no outside help. They were always short on weapons, and they were fighting across a massive, complicated chain of islands. A conventional war was just never going to work for them. So this new phase of the war, the guerrilla phase, and the American response to it, it got ugly. Incredibly ugly. And the human cost was just staggering. For the United States, the price was high. Over 4,200 American soldiers lost their lives. Now, to put that in perspective, that's more than were killed in the entire Spanish-American War that started this whole thing. But as high as that number is, it's just a fraction of the losses on the Filipino side. We're talking an estimated 20,000 Filipino soldiers killed in combat. And then there's the civilian toll. This is the number that's just devastating. Beyond the battlefield, it's estimated that as many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died. They died from the violence, yes, but also from the famine and disease that just tore through the countryside. It was an absolute catastrophe for the Filipino people. And these shocking numbers,
They're the result of some truly brutal tactics. To stamp out the guerrilla movement, U.S. forces burned entire villages and used torture. They forced civilians into what they called reconcentration camps. But we have to be clear, this was a vicious cycle. Filipino fighters used their own brutal tactics too, like torturing captured soldiers and terrorizing any civilians they suspected of working with the Americans. It was just awful all around.
As this brutal war dragged on, the U.S. realized that pure military force might not be enough to win. So they developed this kind of two-part strategy, a carrot and stick approach, if you will.
The stick was the army, obviously. But the carrot, well, that was something they called the policy of attraction. It was basically a campaign designed to win the hearts and minds of the Filipino people, especially the wealthy elites, and cut the legs out from under the revolution.
And this wasn't just some empty promise or propaganda. It was actually a really smart, sophisticated campaign. The U.S. government brought in social reforms. They started planning for economic development, and this is the key part, they allowed a pretty significant amount of local self-government. It was super effective at persuading Filipino elites to switch sides, which of course really hurt the revolutionary cause.
So, between the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901 and this clever policy of attraction, the main organized resistance started to wind down. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not at all. It was really just the start of a whole new chapter.
President Teddy Roosevelt officially said the war was over in 1902, but just look at how long it took to get to actual independence. It was a slow, slow burn. 5 years just to get their first elected assembly. They didn't get a promise of eventual independence until 1916. Then, in 1935, they became a self-governing commonwealth. And full independence? That didn't finally happen until 1946, almost half a century after the war began.
And that brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? The Philippine-American War is so often overlooked, but it was a really defining moment. It forced the United States to face a massive contradiction. How can a nation that was born in an anti-colonial revolution turn around and become a colonial power itself? So we have to ask, how did this forgotten, brutal, and complicated war truly shape America's identity on the world stage?